Coming up later in the program, we're going to ask whether the Australian government should be doing anything at all to help Julian Assange. I think not. And I've also got some interesting stuff from the American presidential debate that I think plays into how politics is unfolding here in Australia. So stay tuned for those segments coming up later in the program. But first up now, I want to cross live to Canberra, where we're joined by the Resources Minister, Josh Frydenberg. Thanks for joining us, Josh.
Nice to be with you, Chris.
Look, I want to come to some issues in the resources portfolio later in the interview because there's been some quite fascinating developments in the past week. But first up, we really have to start on some of these breaking news issues of today. And first up, I wanted to ask you about Daniel Andrews, the Victorian Premier. You, of course, are a Victorian MP yourself. Has he overstepped the mark here in demanding the overturning, effectively, of federal government offshore processing policy?
Well, Daniel Andrews misses the point, which is it's not about finding a good home for these children who are currently in detention. It's about protecting the integrity of our border system, and his intervention cuts across the Labor Party's position at a federal level, which is to support the offshore processing system. Now, this government, the Turnbull government, has been extremely successful in protecting our borders. We've been able to close 13 out of 17 detention centres. We inherited 2,000 children in detention. That number has been reduced to just under 100. And we've obviously stopped the flow of unauthorised boat arrivals, which numbered some 50,000 during the Labor years and tragically led to so many deaths at sea.
We know that scenario. Should state premiers like Daniel Andrews butt out of this area though and concede that this is an area of federal government policy, clear federal government responsibility, and they shouldn't be arguing against that policy publicly?
Well, as you say, it's in the Constitution, Chris. There's a demarcation of responsibility. There's federal responsibilities and there's state responsibilities. Now, the government will do everything possible to look after the welfare of these children. And Peter Dutton has said he will look at each case on its individual merits, and he's not going to be putting children into harm's way. And the fact that he has dramatically reduced the number of children in detention from 2,000 to under 100, and we want to get it to 0 because one child in detention is one child too many. That's the way to go about it, not these ad hoc measures or pleas from state premiers, which cuts across a bipartisan position at the federal level.
Now, nonetheless, some of what Daniel Andrews says suggests that children will be maltreated, that they're going to be abused in some way if they go to Nauru. Now, I've been to Nauru and checked some of this out, and I know that a lot of the information that's put out is completely erroneous and is completely fabricated. But shouldn't you, as a government, be doing more to make sure that people like Daniel Andrews, the Premier of the second largest state, that some of the leading advocates, that perhaps opposition figures, that people in the media actually get a chance to see what's happening on Nauru and ensure that Australia, of course, is doing everything it possibly can to care for people as best we can, give them good education, good health care, and make sure they're well cared for while we try and resettle them somewhere else?
Well, the government's in constant dialogue with all the key organisations in this who are interested in this space, as well as obviously through the media.
You don't seem to be able to convince them. They're not convinced at all. They're sprouting day in and day out that the government's effectively abusing children.
But Chris, you know that's been the case for as long as this issue has been such a vexed one in the domestic political arena. There's always been people who think that you can change the policy overnight and have one which obviously doesn't have anyone in detention, at the same time protects the integrity of our border system. And it's proven in the past that those two goals are mutually exclusive.
Yeah, well, we'll see. My visa's still valid for Nauru. I think about popping back up there, but you wonder whether anyone really cares. I think a lot of people just want to run their lines anyway. I do want to move on to...
Well, absolutely.
I want to run on to the taxation debate. Now, you as Assistant Treasurer in the Abbott government had a direct role in taxation policy under Joe Hockey. Of course, you're in Cabinet now, but it's not your direct area of responsibility. But you must have thought until this morning that a GST increase was very much on the cards.
No, I think, look, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, the rest of the government have been absolutely right to say that we're not ruling in or ruling out any particular measures. Don't forget that Labor, when they commissioned Ken Henry to look at the tax system, ruled out the GST, which is our third largest tax.
Sure,
now,
sorry to interrupt. I mean, that's right. It has been floated, and the debate about the GST is really only just getting started. But you must concede that Malcolm Turnbull effectively shut that down today and said that even the economic case for a GST hasn't been made out, let alone a political one.
Well, I think Malcolm Turnbull has helpfully set out what the key criteria are for tax reform, namely that it doesn't increase the overall tax burden, secondly that it's fair, and thirdly that it creates jobs and growth. Now, he has said it hasn't got over the first hurdle, and you know that is something that will be continued to be discussed at the highest levels within the government. But we are committed to tax reform, and the reason why is because the growing digitalisation of both the Australian and the international economy is affecting the tax take that we have. The fact that more people are moving into the higher tax brackets with bracket creep, the fact that we have an ageing population which is changing the participation rates, all these events that are transforming our economy force us as a government to reassess our tax system, and that's why we commissioned this rethink paper. That's why we've asked for submissions from groups as diverse as the Business Council of Australia to ACOS, and the government is continuing to look at the various alternatives and hold them up to the light by the very criteria that Malcolm Turnbull has set out.
But you've got a budget in structural deficit of upwards of $40 billion, and you've got income tax rates that the Prime Minister has said are too high, a company tax rate that the Prime Minister has said is too high. If you're going to reduce those tax rates, you have to fund them somehow. Now, if you're not going to fund them with a GST increase, where will you fund the tax rate decreases that the Prime Minister says are necessary?
Well, what we've been talking about is the overall tax mix, so it is better attuned to jobs and growth. And I think it's very important to understand when you talk about structural deficits, the way out of that is not increasing taxes but reducing spending. And even Paul Keating weighed into the debate last week, making that very simple point. Now, I can't understand for the life of me why the Labor Party continues to block billions of dollars worth of savings in the Senate, and has also put forward their own proposal to spend tens of billions of dollars in additional expenditure that the country can ill afford. So that's where the focus must be.
I take up those issues with the Labor politicians when they're here, but you can answer on behalf of the government. Your party is committed effectively to lowering income and company tax rates. If you don't do it with a GST increase, you have to find substantial spending cuts, don't you, to be able to deliver any sort of tax relief. Can you find the order of spending cuts, the expenditure reductions that you're going to need to deliver any sort of tax relief at the same time you're desperately trying to bring the budget back into balance?
Yeah. Well, the key is going to be the spending restraint, and we're trying to adopt that right across the whole of government. And as Scott Morrison and Matthias Cormann pointed out, Chris, in my EFO at the end of last year, that spending as a proportion of GDP is coming down from 25.9% today to 25.3% over the forward estimates. That's a significant achievement, particularly when you look at some of the headwinds we face in the Senate. Now, we want to go further, but obviously it depends on what we can legislate through. And given that nearly 90% of government expenditure is tied to legislation, you have to have the support of the Senate, and that's where the Labor Party needs to step up to the plate and walk the talk of being fiscally responsible and live up to what Paul Keating has called for when he's talked about spending restraint.
Well, it wasn't just Paul Keating, of course, it was Peter Costello as well. But you're talking about one budget here in an election year, and if there's not a GST increase, a budget that's got to deliver on reducing the deficit as well as deliver on tax cuts at a time when you can't cut spending too much because you're in an election year, I put it to you that with all this talk about economic reform, we're going to see very little by year's end.
Well, that's wrong, Chris. Firstly, we will have a suite of tax measures that we take to the election. The second thing is the economy is not just about tax reform, it's also about industrial relations reform. And as you know, we've got an important piece of legislation before the Parliament to reinstate the Building and Construction Commission, which was producing a $6 billion annual productivity dividend to the Australian economy. We've removed $4.5 billion worth of red tape. We have a $50 billion infrastructure program that we're rolling out across the nation. That's how you stimulate growth and jobs. Now, you need to look at the fact that over the last year, we saw 300,000 jobs being created in Australia. That was the greatest growth numbers in jobs since 2006. And as the Prime Minister has pointed out in the Parliament, female workforce participation is at record highs. Now, that's the good news about the Australian economy, and the Australian dollar has come down. It acts as an automatic stabiliser, as the Reserve Bank Governor Glenn Stevens has said. That's helping to support the exports that we have now going to be boosting through the 3 free trade agreements with China, Korea and Japan. It's a very good economic story that we have to tell, but we're always looking to go that bit further, and tax reform is an important part of that, and that's why you'll see us take a suite of policies to the next election.
Okay, we've got to get to your portfolio areas, and talking about that economic development.
That'd be good.
Your area of resources is one of those areas that's under enormous pressure, of course, with all the growth coming off, and it's getting even worse by the day, really, with the crashing prices in the energy market. And we saw just last week that coal seam gas projects, a major exploration project put up by the AGL company, was scrapped. And a lot of protesters cheering about that. But are there concerns about what this will do for the Australian resources industry, both in terms of economic development and in domestic gas supply opportunities?
Look, it's a really good question. It's a very important issue, and I welcome the announcement by Mike Baird in recent days that they're going to release more land for gas exploration, because right now coal seam gas represents 40% of the total gas supply on the eastern seaboard of our country. Now, 98.8% of that comes from Queensland with its coal seam gas. Now, there are over 5,000 landowner agreements where there's coexistence between the landowner and the gas company. And the times when they can't reach an amicable agreement, there is an independent dispute mechanism to resolve that. Now, that's a good model. And what we need to see in Australia is more gas supply. The ACCC is looking at this issue, Chris. It's vitally important, not just for domestic industry and domestic households, but it's also important for our exports, because we've seen more than $200 billion worth of invested in LNG projects over the last decade or more, including a number in the coal seam gas area, particularly in Gladstone, which are going to earn tens of billions of dollars for our domestic economy. So this is a vitally important area, and I just call on state governments to work with the federal government, as we're trying to do, to get more gas supply into the market.
Well, that's the domestic side of it. As you say, a guaranteed supply into the future for domestic markets, very important. But you touched on there the export opportunities. Are you concerned that the dramatically depressed energy markets around the world at the moment could put in jeopardy any of those big Australian gas export projects?
Well, I'm not concerned about that right now, because a lot of that investment has either taken place or is currently taking place. So, for example, the biggest construction project in our country is the $70 billion Gorgon project off the coast of Western Australia. It's an LNG project. The next biggest is a $50 billion LNG project in Darwin called the Ichthys project, which will be providing LNG off to Japan. So these contracts are often long dated, they're in place, and we now have that infrastructure to export that gas. But obviously, if the prices are higher, there's more export income into Australia. But who knows what the price will do from here? It's a complex reflection of supply and demand dynamics. And, we've seen in the past, Chris, that the resources sector, be it energy or be it iron ore, be it coal, it often moves in peaks and troughs. And you see massive investment at times of high prices, and that comes off at a time when there are lower prices. So we've been a beneficiary of those high prices, and hopefully over the years ahead we'll continue to earn that export income as a result of those investments.
All right, thanks very much. That's all we've got time for tonight. Josh Frydenberg, appreciate you joining ViewPoint again.
Great to be with you, Chris. Thank you.